Westridge Academy was never meant for students like Malcolm Carter. It was a school designed to keep certain people in and others out. From the start, it was clear he didn't belong. Why? Because Malcolm Carter was the only black student. The moment he stepped into Ms. Whitmore's classroom, she made sure he knew he wasn't welcome. She singled him out, smirking as the class laughed at his expense. His correct answers were marked wrong, his grades cut without reason. Most students would have given up. But Malcolm Carter wasn't like most students. He was the son of Jonathan Carter, a self-made black billionaire who built his empire from nothing. That same fire burned in Malcolm. Ms. Whitmore never realized that the boy she tried to break was raised by a man who refused to lose. She picked a fight she couldn't win. And now, justice is coming for her. Before we continue, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning air carried the quiet hum of routine. Polished hallways reflected the soft glow of early sunlight, and pristine lockers stood in perfect formation, each one a silent testament to the exclusivity of Westridge Academy. It was a school built for the children of CEOs, politicians, and old-money aristocrats, a place where legacy mattered more than merit, and where every student walked with the certainty that the world already belonged to them. And then there was Malcolm Carter. As he moved through the corridor, he could feel it, the lingering glances, the weight of eyes that never stayed too long, but always long enough. The only black student at Westridge, the only one who didn't come from generations of inherited wealth. The Carter name carried power, but it was new money, self-made wealth, and here, that distinction mattered just as much as his skin color. He kept his shoulders squared, his chin lifted, refusing to acknowledge the silent treatment, the casual exclusion, the way conversations softened whenever he passed. He had been here long enough to understand that his place would always be challenged, tested, doubted. And nowhere was that more evident than in Ms. Whitmore's classroom. She stood at the front of the room, poised, her crisp white blouse tucked neatly into a fitted pencil skirt. Her demeanor was as sharp as ever, an educator who prided herself on standards, tradition, and the so-called integrity of Westridge. Her gaze swept across the classroom with practiced precision, as if mentally sorting students into categories, the brilliant, the mediocre, and those who, in her opinion, didn't belong. Malcolm knew exactly which category she had placed him in. He took his seat, second row from the front, already sensing what was coming. This was routine, a pattern, a game she played. The lesson would begin, and at some point, her eyes would find him, sharp and expectant. Her voice would slice through the room like a blade, singling him out with the precision of a predator toying with its prey. She moved toward the board, the click of her heels echoing against the polished floor. With a flick of her wrist, she wrote out a complex equation in clean, deliberate strokes. Since we're preparing for next week's assessment, let's begin with an application problem. Carter. His name cracked through the air like a challenge. A beat of silence followed. Then, slowly, Malcolm lifted his eyes, meeting her gaze with calm indifference. Ms. Whitmore smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the satisfaction of knowing she held the power in this moment. "Go ahead," she said, gesturing toward the board. "Walk us through the solution." He knew what this was. She did this often, and never to anyone else. Malcolm had watched her teach. He knew how she guided students through difficult concepts, offering hints, redirecting their thinking, giving them space to stumble and recover. But not with him. Never with him. For him, there were no hints, no guiding words. She wanted him to fail, to stammer, to hesitate, to prove to the class, to her, that he wasn't as intelligent as he thought he was. A flicker of amusement crossed her face as the silence stretched, as if she was already anticipating his failure. Malcolm stood, moving toward the board with an air of unbothered ease, though he could feel the tension coiling around the moment. He glanced at the equation, absorbing it quickly, immediately recognizing what she had done. She hadn't given him a fair question. This was advanced college-level material, something even the top students in the class wouldn't solve without preparation. A quiet murmur passed through the room. The students weren't blind. They knew this wasn't fair. But fairness had never mattered here. Ms. Whitmore folded her arms, watching, waiting. Malcolm inhaled slowly, then picked up the marker. He could hear his father's voice in the back of his mind, calm, steady. Outthink them. Outwork them. Let your excellence speak for itself. The problem was difficult, but it wasn't impossible. His mind worked through the steps, methodical and sure, reducing the variables, restructuring the function, moving through the calculations with deliberate precision. The room was silent. Ms. Whitmore's expression began to shift. Malcolm reached the final step, underlined his answer, then set the marker down with controlled ease. He turned back, meeting her eyes directly, refusing to let her see even a flicker of doubt. For the briefest moment, she hesitated. A beat of silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Then, she gave a small, dismissive scoff. "Well," she said, lips pursing as she turned back to the board, "you certainly took the long way to get there. Next time, try to be more efficient." A soft wave of laughter rippled through the class, subdued, cautious, but there. Malcolm returned to his seat, his jaw tight, but his expression unreadable. He had solved it, proven himself, and still, she had found a way to diminish it. The game was clear, and so was his next move. The days blurred together, the rhythm of Westridge Academy moving forward in its pristine, carefully curated routine, untouched by the weight of real-world struggles. Students carried their privilege like second skin, oblivious to the silent battle Malcolm fought every time he stepped into the building, the laughter in the hallways, the effortless ease with which his classmates moved through their day. It all existed in stark contrast to the quiet war he waged. Here, he wasn't just another student. He was the exception, the outsider, the unspoken anomaly, and Ms. Whitmore made sure he never forgot it. It started subtly, in the way racism often does, never explicit enough to be called out directly, but unmistakable in its intent. "Carter," she called one morning, her voice carrying that same saccharine edge. "Since you're so—" A slight pause, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Capable. I'm sure you wouldn't mind explaining to the class why your approach yesterday was unconventional." Malcolm exhaled slowly. Unconventional, not wrong, not incorrect, just not the way she wanted him to do it. A carefully chosen word, a way to undermine him without directly calling him incompetent. He pushed back his chair and stood, meeting her gaze as he walked to the front of the class. He had expected this, prepared for it. "Mathematics isn't about memorizing formulas," he said evenly, picking up a marker. His voice was measured, deliberate. "It's about problem solving. There's more than one way to arrive at a solution." Ms. Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but he saw it. The tightening of her jaw, the flicker of something sharp in her eyes. She murmured, tilting her head. "That's a creative perspective, though I suppose some students are more comfortable taking shortcuts." A few students snickered, but not all. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The ones who had actually paid attention yesterday knew he hadn't taken a shortcut at all. Malcolm set the marker down without a word and returned to his seat. She hadn't been looking for an answer. She had been looking for an opening, and the pattern continued. Every class, she found a new way to put him on the spot, to make him stumble, to reinforce the idea that he was not like the others. During a discussion on historical mathematicians, she remarked casually, "Of course, in certain cultures, academics weren't exactly prioritized for quite some time. There was more of a, shall we say, reliance on physical ability." Malcolm sat still. So did the rest of the class. The silence stretched a little too long, the kind that made people shift in their seats, unsure if they had really just heard what they thought they had. Ms. Whitmore smiled thinly, her gaze moving past Malcolm as if she hadn't just spoken directly about him without saying his name. She had chosen her battlefield, and so had he. That week, she laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Don't be so hard on yourself, Michael. Some people just aren't born with a head for numbers." Then, without missing a beat, she added, "But you know who must be, right, Carter?" The implication sat heavy in the air. She let it hang as if expecting him to react. He didn't. Not yet. His father had taught him early that there was no point in shouting when people had already decided not to listen. So Malcolm didn't push back. Not yet. He let her think she was winning because he had a plan. The next test was coming up, one he had already begun preparing for the moment she first called him out. Every problem she had ever given, every pattern in her grading, every subtle way she had marked him down, he documented it all. She wanted to prove that he didn't belong here? Fine. He'd prove something else entirely. And when the grades came back, there would be no denying the truth, not even for her. The day of the test arrived with the same polished perfection that Westridge Academy exuded in every corner of its campus. Sunlight poured through tall windows, casting sharp geometric patterns across the pristine tile floors. The school's unshakable elegance stood as a quiet reminder of its exclusivity. Students filtered into the classroom, some confident, others anxious. But Malcolm sat still, unmoving, his hands clasped together in front of him as his gaze remained fixed on the blank sheet of paper that Ms. Whitmore had just placed on his desk. He didn't need to look up to know she was watching him. She always was. Her voice rang out smoothly, her tone light but laced with something sharper. "I trust everyone has prepared accordingly. Of course, some of us will find this more challenging than others." A few students chuckled, but it was forced, hesitant, as if they weren't entirely sure whether they were supposed to laugh. Malcolm didn't react. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't fought in the moment. They were won in the long game. He picked up his pen and began. The questions were difficult, but not beyond him. He had anticipated this, the extra layers of complexity, the deliberately worded traps, the near-impossible calculations slipped between standard problems designed to rattle him, to make him hesitate. But hesitation had no place here. He worked through each equation methodically, breaking them down, his mind moving with precision. His classmates began shifting, sighing in frustration as they struggled through the test. Malcolm kept writing. Ms. Whitmore moved between the rows, the sharp click, click, click of her heels against the tile floor, the only sound that broke the quiet. When she reached his desk, she lingered, a shadow at the edge of his vision, her presence pressing down on him like a silent challenge. She wanted to unnerve him. He kept his focus on the paper, his hand steady. When he finished, he set down his pen and leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. Around him, his classmates were still hunched over their tests, the occasional frantic erasing filling the silence. Ms. Whitmore came to a stop beside him. "Done already, Carter?" The question was casual, but the undertone wasn't. He turned his head slightly, met her gaze, and let the silence settle between them. "Yes." She tilted her head, her lips curving ever so slightly. That was all she said before walking away. But Malcolm had seen it, the flicker of irritation behind her eyes. She had expected him to struggle. He hadn't. The next class period, Ms. Whitmore stood at the front of the room, the test papers stacked neatly in her hands. "I must say," she began, her voice slow, deliberate, "I'm surprised by the results." A few students tensed, waiting for the inevitable drop. There were, of course, the usual strong performances, and then, unfortunately, there were those who, let's just say, proved my concerns correct. Her gaze swept across the room before landing on Malcolm. The papers began circulating. Students murmured, flipping through their tests, some sighing in relief, others groaning in disappointment. Then Malcolm's paper landed on his desk. He stared at it. 64%. For a moment, he didn't move. He just looked at the number, the bold red ink slashing across the top of the page like a deliberate wound. The absurdity of it was so blatant that it almost felt laughable. He had double-checked every answer. He knew the material better than anyone in this room. Slowly, he flipped through the pages. Point deductions for correct answers, arbitrary markings, vague criticisms, unanswered explanations. She hadn't even tried to hide it. A slow-burning heat built in his chest, curling into his fingertips as he clenched the paper just slightly, his breath coming in steady, controlled inhales. He felt her watching him, waiting. She wanted a reaction. He wouldn't give her one. Not yet. As the class ended and students began filing out, Malcolm remained seated, his test paper still on his desk, untouched since he had flipped through it. Ms. Whitmore lingered at the front of the room, sorting through her materials, her posture unbothered, her expression cool. Malcolm rose. He walked toward her with measured steps, not angry, not emotional, just calm, controlled, deliberate. He set the test down on her desk. "I'd like an explanation." She looked up at him, her lips curling into that same thin, amused smile. "For what exactly?" His voice was even. "For why you took points off for correct answers." A slow blink, then a slight tilt of her head. "Oh, Carter, I understand that you must be disappointed, but sometimes confidence can lead to carelessness. Perhaps you didn't pay as much attention as you thought." His grip on the edge of her desk tightened slightly. "I showed my work." She sighed, shaking her head as though he was a child throwing a tantrum. "Mathematics isn't just about getting the answer. It's about comprehension. And I just don't think you fully understand the material." Something inside him snapped. His voice came out lower, sharper. "You don't think I understand? Or you don't want me to?" A flicker of something passed across her face. Not surprise, not outrage, but something colder. A challenge. "Carter," she said smoothly, "if you spent as much time studying as you do making accusations, perhaps your grade would reflect your intelligence." He stared at her, the weight of unspoken words pressing at the back of his throat. But he swallowed them down. Not here. Not yet. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the classroom, his pulse steady, his mind already working. If she thought this was over, she was wrong. This was just the beginning. She let out a humorless laugh, then looked at me, just long enough to make sure I knew she was talking about me, but not long enough to lose the ability to deny it if she had to. His father's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. "She's comfortable," Jonathan said, his voice measured, controlled. "She's been getting away with this for so long that she doesn't even bother hiding it anymore." "Yeah, well, I'm sick of it," Malcolm muttered, his knuckles pressing into the armrest. "It doesn't even matter what I do. If I fail, I don't belong. If I succeed, I must have cheated. If I speak up, I'm aggressive. If I stay quiet, I lack confidence. No matter what, I lose." For a moment, his father said nothing. The car glided smoothly down the wide avenue leading toward their neighborhood, the grand houses standing like monuments to a life that was supposed to be free from these kinds of struggles. But Malcolm knew. Money didn't shield you from everything. Jonathan finally spoke. "You think I don't know how that feels?" Malcolm glanced at him, but his father's eyes remained fixed on the road, his expression unreadable. "You think I didn't deal with the same thing?" Jonathan continued, his voice quieter now but no less firm. The looks, the doubt, the little jabs disguised as observations. He scoffed, shaking his head slightly. "I used to walk into business meetings and they'd assume I was someone's assistant. I'd sit at the table and they'd talk over me like I wasn't even there. And when I finally did speak, they'd act surprised, like intelligence was unexpected from me." Malcolm sat back, his grip on the crumpled paper loosening slightly. His father exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. I know what you're feeling, son. I know it's frustrating. I know it makes you want to put your fist through a wall. But let me tell you something. He turned slightly then, just enough for Malcolm to catch the sharpness in his eyes, the quiet but undeniable force in his words. The worst thing you can do is give them the reaction they're looking for. Malcolm looked away, his throat tightening. So what am I supposed to do? Just take it? Jonathan pressed his lips together for a moment, then spoke, his voice softer but firm. Number, you make it impossible for them to ignore you. He paused, then added, you let your work speak so loudly that they can't twist the narrative. You let them throw everything they have at you. And then you stand up, wipe yourself off, and do it again. Better. Malcolm exhaled slowly. I'm already doing that. I know, his father said, steady. And you're going to keep doing it. They pulled into the long driveway of their home, the massive estate standing quiet in the evening glow. Jonathan parked, but didn't move to open the door just yet. Instead, he turned fully to Malcolm, studying him for a long moment, before finally saying, You don't fight small battles, son. You don't waste energy proving yourself to people who aren't worth it. You focus on the bigger picture. Malcolm swallowed. His father's voice lowered slightly. But when the time comes to fight? A small pause. You make damn sure you win. Malcolm met his father's gaze, something inside him shifting, settling deep. He nodded once. Jonathan exhaled, then reached into the center console, pulling out a thin envelope. By the way, he said casually, handing it over. Got this earlier. Didn't get a chance to show you. Malcolm took it, brow furrowing slightly, as he pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. His eyes skimmed over the first few lines, then froze. A slow, disbelieving breath left his lips. I got into the National Honor Society. Jonathan's mouth twitched. You sound surprised? Malcolm blinked at the letter. After everything today, I wasn't expecting this. His father smiled slightly, a knowing look in his eyes. It doesn't matter what she says, son. The people who matter, they see you. Malcolm stared at the letter a moment longer, then carefully folded it, slipping it back into the envelope. He met his father's gaze, nodded once, and stepped out of the car. Tomorrow, Ms. Whitmore would try again. He was sure of it, but she had no idea what was coming. I thought we'd start today with a little review. The marker cap clicked off. A sharp stroke across the whiteboard. Then another. A long, intricate equation, deliberately complex, designed to make him hesitate, to make him falter under the weight of expectation. Miss Whitmore turned back, her gaze locking onto him with the precision of a well-placed dagger. Carter. The way she said it, it wasn't just a name, it was a challenge. A few quiet snickers rose from the back of the room. Malcolm exhaled slowly and stood, already knowing exactly how this was going to play out. Miss Whitmore stepped aside, gesturing toward the equation she had just written. Since you were so confident in your approach last time, she said, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. Let's see if you can handle this one. Malcolm picked up the marker, his fingers steady as he examined the problem. Difficult, but not impossible. He had prepared for this, and so he started solving it. He could have let her have the final word, unchallenged, unquestioned, but he hadn't. And now, for the first time, the balance had shifted. A muscle twitched in her jaw, but just as quickly, her expression smoothed, replaced with that same false amusement, the one she always wore when she wanted to pretend he was simply being irrational. Well, she said lightly, flipping through a stack of papers on her desk as if nothing had happened. I think that's enough distractions for one morning. Let's move on. The class hesitated. A beat of silence. Uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Then, one by one, the students turned back to their notes, some shifting awkwardly in their seats, others avoiding Malcolm's gaze entirely. And just like that, the moment passed. But not for Malcolm. Not for her. Miss Whitmore didn't look at him again for the rest of the class, but he knew. This wasn't over. The bell rang, sharp and final, signaling the end of the lesson. Malcolm had barely stood when he heard her voice. "Carter," a word. His jaw clenched. Miss Whitmore didn't wait for a response. She turned, walking briskly toward the door, her heels clicking against the polished floor with deliberate intensity. The expectation was clear. He was to follow. The class hesitated again. A few students glanced at Malcolm before quickly looking away. They knew. Everyone knew. He grabbed his bag and followed. By the time the last student filtered out, the door had barely clicked shut before she turned on him, her voice low, sharp, cutting straight through the air. "Who do you think you are?" Malcolm didn't flinch. He had seen this coming. But even though he had expected it, even though he had prepared for it, there was something about the way she was looking at him now, cold, unfiltered rage barely disguised beneath a thin veneer of control, that made his blood run hot. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay steady. "You don't get to speak to me like that in front of my class," she continued, stepping closer, voice dropping to something sharper, something that cut like glass. "I will not be disrespected by someone like you." Malcolm felt it, felt the weight of those last few words, the way she packed everything she meant into them. Someone like you. Heat crept into his chest, a slow burning frustration that had been simmering for weeks now. Months. Every insult, every unfair grade, every time she treated him like he was less. He inhaled, exhaled. So now it's disrespect? His voice was quiet, steady, but there was a razor's edge to it. "But when you disrespected me in front of everyone, that was fine?" She let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, please, don't act like some victim." Her expression twisted with something like disdain. "You have an attitude problem, Carter. A serious one. And I don't know what your father has been teaching you, but let me be very clear." She stepped even closer. Her voice lowered, harsh and deliberate, something only he could hear. "I don't care who your daddy is. In my classroom, you are nothing special." The words hit like a slap, not because they were unexpected, because he knew exactly what she meant. She wasn't talking about his father, not really. She was talking about him, about his presence at Westridge, about how, no matter what he did, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how brilliant he was, in her eyes, he would always be nothing special. His fists clenched tighter, nails biting into his palms. His pulse pounded in his ears, a slow, controlled fury barely contained. He had never wanted to punch a wall before. But right now, he felt like he could put his fist straight through the damn plaster. But he wouldn't, because that's what she wanted. She wanted him to break, to snap, to lose his temper so she could paint him exactly the way she wanted him to be seen. Aggressive, angry, a problem. He inhaled, exhaled, and forced himself to unclench his hands. He wasn't going to give her that. Not now, not ever. She studied him, waiting, searching for the reaction she wanted. When he didn't give it to her, her eyes narrowed, just slightly. She exhaled sharply, straightening, smoothed out her skirt with slow, deliberate precision. "Since you seem to have such strong opinions, Carter," she said, her voice slipping back into its usual controlled condescension, "I look forward to seeing how well you perform on the next test." She turned, without waiting for a response, walking back into the classroom, her posture stiff, controlled. But Malcolm could feel it. She was angry. She wasn't done, and neither was he. The days leading up to the second test were a slow, simmering build-up, a storm forming beneath the polished, untouchable surface of Westridge Academy. Malcolm could feel it, with every glance Miss Whitmore threw his way, with every sharp remark in class, with every moment she spent watching him, waiting for him to break. But she was the one making the mistake now. She thought this was still a game. She thought she could push him, manipulate him, control the narrative. She thought she had won. What she didn't realize, Malcolm had already started playing by his own rules. He started tracking everything, every insult, every unfair comment. Every moment she singled him out for the hardest questions while lobbing softballs to the rest of the class. At first, it was just notes, dates, times, the exact wording of the things she said, the way students reacted, who laughed, who shifted uncomfortably, who avoided looking at him altogether. Then he went further. A small voice memo app running in his pocket during class, capturing her words, the quiet murmurs of laughter, the weight of moments she pretended didn't exist. It wasn't enough to know the truth. He had to be able to prove it. The morning of the test, Malcolm walked into the classroom, feeling nothing but calm, controlled certainty. Miss Whitmore was already waiting, arms crossed, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She thought this was her moment. She thought today was the day she would finally put him in his place. "Take your seats," she said smoothly, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Remember, this test will be a strong indicator of your performance in this class. I suggest you all take it very seriously." She didn't need to say it. The message was already clear. She wasn't talking to everyone. She was talking to him. Malcolm sat down, pulse steady, hands loose as he picked up his pencil. He flipped over the first page, and he already knew. The test was difficult, deliberately so, but he had prepared for everything. The clock ticked down as he moved through each problem, one step at a time, precise, methodical. Every answer boxed in crisp, deliberate strokes. Around him, his classmates shifted, sighed, erased frantically. A boy 3 seats away groaned under his breath, muttering about how he was going to fail. Malcolm just kept writing. The last problem, the final step. He boxed the answer, set his pencil down, and without hesitation, he reached into his bag, pulled out his phone, and took a picture of every single page. When the test ended, Malcolm walked straight to Miss Whitmore's desk and set his paper down in front of her. Her gaze flicked up, and for a fraction of a second, he saw it. The hesitation, the flicker of irritation behind her eyes. She had expected him to struggle, to be shaken. Instead, he stood there, perfectly composed. Her fingers curled around the stack of papers. "We'll see how well you did," she said, her voice laced with that same false amusement. "Though if history is any indication, I wouldn't get your hopes up too high." Malcolm didn't blink. "Neither would I." And then he turned and walked out.